Right, get the jokes out of the way. Right, as you may know, today is the National Library's Health and Wellbeing Day. But in this auditorium, for the next 45 minutes, you won't be getting any tips on how to eat well or look after yourself, because by some unfortunate coincidence in the diary, I'm here to talk to you about blinding, castration, and other aspects of physical mutilation in medieval Wales. Now, you may have noticed, as Gwyn says, that there's no visual images apart from the library's logo behind me on the screen. That's because images from the 12th century are rare, especially when it comes to the mutilation of people in Wales. Welsh manuscripts aren't particularly full of illustrations. And if you've seen the poster for this talk, the illustration there is of someone having his hair pulled. And that is taken from a legal manuscript, Penarth 28, Hywel Laws, which deals with injury and compensation, that particular section. There's nothing to do with mutilation at all. It's just a nice picture. But it's the nearest thing we've got from medieval Wales. I'm sure there are videos on the internet of people being judicially mutilated under Sharia law, but I won't be showing any of those either. So if you want illustrations of medieval mutilation, I think the images generated by your own imagination will probably be enough. And although if anybody would like to take part in a live demonstration, they're welcome to volunteer. The full title of this presentation begins with a graphic quotation. Ac y tynnodd I lygaid o'i ben ac y dispaddodd ef. And he gouged his eyes out of his head and castrated him. And the original is in Middle Welsh and is taken from the text of a manuscript now known as Penarth 20, which was part of the National Library's founding collection. The manuscript is a codex or bound volume, and the bulk of it seems to have been brought together in the 1330s. It contains a number of separate texts, including a biblical text, a Merlinic prophecy poem, a bardic grammar, and most importantly, from the point of view of medieval historians, a translation into Welsh of a lost Latin chronicle covering the period from AD 682 to 1282, with an extension to 1332. This is known as Brut y Tywysogion, or the Chronicle of the Princes, and it's especially detailed from the turn of the 12th century onwards. It appears to have been written by the monks at Strata Florida, drawing on earlier material compiled at the abbey there, and also at Llanbadarn Fawr and elsewhere. The Penarth 20 version of the Brit is the earliest extant copy of the text, and is also the fullest and most reliable chronicle source for medieval Wales. Most significantly for today's purposes, no extant manuscript that I'm aware of contains more instances of mutilation in medieval Wales. Penarth 20 was also the first item in the library that I ever worked on and studied in depth. I've worked on a few other things since then, but when I was asked to give a talk about something in the library's collections, this manuscript seemed a good choice. And the idea for this subject, mutilation, came from an article by Professor Charles Warren Hollister in 1978, in which he discussed the use of physical mutilation by the English King Henry I, one of the sons of William the Conqueror. The incident referred to in the quotation earlier is the mutilation of Owain Pencarn, a member of a native Welsh dynasty in Gwent, by his nephew Hywel ap Iorwerth of Caerleon, which is recorded in the Penarth 20 version of the Brit under the year 1175. In this talk, I'd like to try to set this apparently gratuitous act of viciousness in its proper context. How normal were incidents like this? What were they supposed to achieve? How did people justify them? And what do they tell us about 12th century Wales? To answer these questions, we'll have to look at native Wales and also at the wider world. Why did Hywel think it acceptable to blind and castrate his own uncle? And why would the idea have occurred to him in the first place? To Western Europeans in the 21st century, mutilation seemed a cruel and barbaric way to treat other human beings. But in the medieval period, it was a widespread means of social and political control throughout Europe, China, India, and the Muslim world. As a punishment, it's at least as old as recorded history. There are plenty of examples of it in Herodotus's histories of the Persian kings, for example, and archaeological evidence suggests that it may be much older. Maybe. In medieval Europe, mutilation was a statutory punishment, and in most countries its victims were usually convicted thieves, murderers, rapists, arsonists, confidence tricksters, and other criminals. It was believed they were sinners, and they were lucky to be mutilated rather than put to death. Mutilation encouraged them to do penance for their crimes and reform their behaviour, and thereby potentially saved them from the far worse torments of eternal damnation in hell. King Henry II, the father of Richard the Lionheart and King John, is well known for his legal reforms in 12th century England, including the introduction of trial by jury. He preferred to inflict mutilation rather than capital punishment on criminals. And his justiciar, Ranulph Glanville, noted that whereas capital crimes were punished by death, lesser offences were dealt with, quote, more leniently, because the victims suffered only loss of limbs. All the same, mutilation was a severe punishment. First of all, there was the immediate physical pain. According to Gerald of Wales, the pain experienced when a man has his testicles cut off is felt mostly in his teeth. He wasn't speaking from personal experience, but this detail emerges in a truly horrific story in which a mutilated prisoner took his revenge on the lord of the castle of Châteauroux in Berry in France by blackmailing him into castrating himself. The prisoner then leapt to his death from the castle walls, taking the lord's only son with him. So the physical and emotional suffering in Gerald's story is terrible, but the pain didn't end there. Castration meant that victims, like the Lord of Châteauroux, would be unable to produce heirs. And in a dynastically orientated society, the lack of a male heir was a disaster. Henry VIII is probably the most famous example of how far people were prepared to go to avoid this, but he was by no means the most desperate case. For example, when Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, was killed at Bannockburn in 1314, his widow was so concerned at the lack of an heir that she faked a pregnancy for 2 years. You see where Monty Python get their material from. The effects of mutilation were even worse for the lower classes. For them, it was already difficult enough to make a living. Many forms of mutilation would make them unable to find work. And in a world with unreliable welfare provision, that could easily mean that it effectively ended a person's useful life in society. In Wales, mutilation could even mean social disaster for royalty, because one of the remnants of the ancient sacral role of kings was that candidates for kingship could be barred from taking office by a physical deformity, whether it was congenital or acquired in later life. There's an echo here of the stipulation in the book of Leviticus that no blemished creature was fit for the service of God. But whether the idea came to Wales from scripture or arose from within native tradition is not entirely clear. Some notion of the potential implications of this idea can be found in other European countries. In early medieval Byzantium, for example, the emperor was regarded as a god, and he was required to be unblemished. So it's not unusual, I think there's a couple of dozen examples, for individuals to be taken out of contention for the imperial throne by acts of mutilation, usually blinding, but also the removal of tongues, noses, hands and genitalia. They tended to go for the face. Similarly, in Ireland, several early medieval kings were deposed from power after sustaining deforming injuries in battle. Perhaps the most colourful example is that of Conall Coich, I think I pronounced that right, the half-blind, who, according to an almost contemporary legal text, was forced to give up the kingship of Tara in the 7th century after being blinded in one eye by a swarm of bees. True story, apparently. The most well-known case in Wales is that of Llywelyn the Great's father, Iorwerth ab Owain. When his father died in 1170, Iorwerth took no part in the five-way contest for Gwynedd that was fought between his brothers. This was despite the fact that Iorwerth was very soon, after a couple of months, the eldest surviving son of Owain Gwynedd. It's generally considered that the main reason for his failure to challenge for the kingship is hinted at least in part, by his nickname, Iorwerth Drwyn, or Flat Nose. Similarly, Meredydd and Cynwrig, two sons of the Lord Rhys ap Gruffydd of Deheubarth, were also excluded from power, this time because of actual mutilation. Both of them were middle-aged when their father died in 1197, and they both lived till the 1230s, but neither of them took any part in the struggle for power in the kingdom that took place around the turn of the 13th century.